Hey, when I was a kid, some of my favorite books were the Chronicles of Narnia series, starting with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And when I first read them, I just liked them because they were interesting children's stories. Like, I just loved the literature. They told good stories. They were about exciting things. I loved the good versus evil mindset that took place within the books. And it wasn't until years later, I don't remember how old I was, but it wasn't until years later that I learned that they were written as an allegory. They were written to demonstrate something else. And C.S. Lewis was a Christian, someone who came to Christ later in life. He was a professor, and he wrote these books to communicate the gospel of Jesus Christ in a different way, in a creative way, with different characters in the story representing different and familiar characters that we would be familiar with as Christians. The most obvious of which is Aslan, the lion, represents Jesus, is the Jesus character in the story. And this isn't a spoiler alert because these books have been around forever. So if you're hearing this, you've had since 1950 to read these things. But in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Aslan the lion dies and then comes back to life and is resurrected. So he represents Jesus in the books, and then it kind of culminates with the last battle, which is an analogy or an allegory to the book of Revelation in the Bible. If you like to read, I would encourage you to pick these books up. Actually, all of these books, with the exception of My Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, are the original books that I had when I was a kid. I have no idea what happened to My Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe book, but it's gone. But I have the original series, the original rest of the ones that I had when I was a kid. And what Paul does in Galatians chapter 4 is he also gives an allegory. He also gives an illustration. But the difference between what Paul's doing and what C.S. Lewis is doing is Paul's allegory or Paul's illustration is based on a historical fact. So Paul is talking about in the letter to the churches of Galatia that there's a way to live in accordance with the law that doesn't honor God, because it's not the law that frees us, it's Christ who frees us. And Paul goes into this story. He pulls this history out of the Old Testament, beginning in Genesis chapter 12 through about Genesis 21. I recommend you go back and kind of read through that story. And what Paul does is he's saying, hey, that there's this historical thing that happened, and there's a deeper meaning within that text. Verse 23 says, the son of the slave wife was born in a human attempt to bring about the fulfillment of God's promise. This is Galatians 4. But the son of the freeborn wife was born as God's own fulfillment of his promise. Verse 24, Galatians 4, these two women serve as an illustration for God's two covenants. The first woman, Hagar, represents Mount Sinai, where people received the law that enslaved them. Verse 25, and now Jerusalem is like Mount Sinai in Arabia, because she and her children live in slavery to the law. But the other woman, verse 26, Sarah, represents the heavenly Jerusalem. She's the free woman, and she is our mother. So what Paul is saying is he's clearly identifying these characters from this historical event, this historical story, Sarah and Hagar. And what he's saying is, yes, they were real people, and this really happened, and it's a real story. And what they represent, there's an allegory here, there's an illustration. What they represent is the two different covenants. One of those covenants is the covenant of the law. The other one of those covenants is the covenant of the promise, or the covenant of grace, where God has promised to Abraham that he would have offspring. Ultimately, as we talked about several months ago back in Galatians chapter 3, the ultimate offspring that God was referring to when he was talking to Abraham was not Isaac, but it was Jesus. And what Paul is saying in this text is when we live according to the law, when we live according to our striving, to our own effort, what happens is that leads to spiritual slavery. He used two phrases earlier in chapter 4, very similar phrases about the spiritual principles of the world. So when we try and save ourselves, we are living in accordance with this basic spiritual principles of the world. We're trying to save ourselves. We're trying to raise ourselves up. We're trying to demonstrate self-righteousness, be right in our own eyes. There's a difference between that and living in accordance to God's freedom. See, when we live according to the law, what we find is slavery, because we can't keep up, because we can't do it, because we have to continue to try, we have to continue to effort, we have to continue to say things and do things in order to meet the bar. And what Paul is telling the church in Galatia is when you live in accordance to God's freedom, God's promise, what you find is freedom. When you trust that what God has done in the person of Jesus, you find freedom. That's my hope for you today, is that you will ask yourself, am I living in accordance with the law? Am I living in accordance with human effort? Am I striving to save myself? Or am I resting in the finished work of Jesus? My hope and my prayer for you is that it is the latter, that you are resting in the work and the hope of Jesus. Love you. Talk to you again soon.